Chapter 38. The Vatican and the Conflict. A key fact to an understanding of the church and state problem is to face up to the fact that the state not only fought the church, but worked to subvert it. We have seen that Marsilius, or Marsiglio Padua, wrote against the church and was a promoter of statism. He and John of Jandun were under the protection of the Emperor Louis IV, the Bavarian, in his battle against the church. The influence of Marsilius may have decided Louis IV in favour of marching on Rome. The Franciscan, Peter of Corbara, was set up as an anti-pope under the title of Nicholas V, and Marsilius was named papal vicar of Rome and Archbishop of Milan. The man Louis, or Ludwig, made Pope, Nicholas V, 1447 to 1455, did little to reform the church. Rather, he began what the Renaissance popes continued, that is, to make the church an art centre. He imported artists and scholars to make Rome a cultural centre. It had been previously surpassed and disdained by the cathedral cities of France, England, and Italy. It was now to chart a course very different from that of popes who fought for the freedom of the church. Quote-unquote culture and statism began to replace Christianity as a faith-creating and governing society. We have seen how the Council of Constance was concerned more with controlling the papacy and the church than with reforming it. In time, prelates and priests became actors more than men of God, and the church service became high pageantry rather than pure worship. In the process, the College of Cardinals had also become the tool of monarchs rather than the voice of the church. As a result, after the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the church became progressively weaker and the state stronger. Both Catholics and Protestants retreated into pietism and into ecclesiastical, institutional, and pietistic concerns. Pope Benedict XIV, 1740 to 1758, a more vigorous pope than others of his era, in his long encyclical Sex Quo Primum, took time, among other things, to attack the Church of Armenia for adhering to the Mosaic Law, and in particular the dietary laws. In the 19th century, the popes began again to deal with the church and state issue. Pope Gregory XVI, 1831 to 1846, issued an encyclical on the issue on May 17, 1835, Commissum Divinitas. This was an answer to the assembly at Baden, which sought to give power to the, quote, civil authority either to approve or to oppose the celebration of the diocesan synods, and to inspect the synods, to oversee seminaries, and to confirm the system of their internal governance established by bishops, to remove clerics from ecclesiastical duties, to govern the religious and moral instruction of the people, and finally to regulate everything which, they claim, pertains to the external discipline of the Church, although these things may be of a spiritual nature or character, and may concern the worship of God and the salvation of souls. End quote. Pius IX, 1846 to 1878, was vigorous on the offensive against the enemies of the Church and opponents of papal supremacy. His encyclical Incredibili, September 17, 1863, opposed the attempt of the Republic of New Granada to control the Church. Maximi Quidem, August 14, 1864, was directed against a like effort in Bavaria. The problem, as Quanta Cura, December 8, 1864, made clear, was that the state held it had, quote, a right of property in those goods which are possessed by the Church, by the religious orders, and by other pious establishments, end quote. This was increasingly the problem everywhere in Europe. In Poland and in Russia, the clergy were actually imprisoned and robbed. Esti Multa, November 21, 1873, dealt with the problem facing the Church in Italy, Germany, and Switzerland. In Vix Dum, a Nobis, March 7, 1874, the attempt of Austria to control the Church was dealt with, and in Quod Nunquam, February 5, 1875, the offender was Prussia. In the Syllabus of Errors, 1864, Pius IX catalogued the humanistic heresies of the day and condemned them. He saw clearly that the age sought to deprive the Church of its prerogatives and freedom. On the other hand, he sought to reiterate every claim of the Church against civil governments and other branches of the Church, and in Vatican Council I, 1870, had the doctrine of papal infallibility proclaimed. The Ultramontanes pushed papal claims to the limit. The Pope, Pius IX in particular, was called, quote, King of Kings, end quote. Hymns to the Roman Breviary addressed to God were addressed to Pius IX. Quote, the semi-official Vatican journal, La Civita Cattolica, took the liberty of writing, quote, when the Pope meditates, it is God who thinks in him, end quote. Bishop Berthaud of Tulle described the Pope as, quote, the Word of God made flesh, living in our midst, end quote. The Bishop of Geneva spoke of a triple incarnation of God the Son in Jesus, in the Eucharist, and in the Pope. Pius IX was called, quote, Redeemer, end quote, and, quote, God on earth, end quote. St. John Bosco said, quote, Jesus had put the Pope on the same level as God, end quote. Miraculous powers were ascribed to Pius IX. In 1866, Pius IX applied to himself Christ's words, quote, I am the way, the truth, and the life, end quote. By this means, Pius IX made the position of the Church ridiculous in the eyes of all too many. The centre of attention shifted from the freedom of the Church to the extravagant claims of the papacy. It was made easier for the humanistic state to pose as the arm of liberating reason against a reactionary and oppressive old order. As a Catholic scholar has noted, the ideal for the Church was now made into a trust in a super-pope and a devotion to the Pope. Quote, the life of the Catholic Church ever since has been deeply disturbed by it, end quote. Vatican II was in part a reaction to this. Without touching Vatican I, it stressed, in Tillard's words, quote, that the Church of God, seen in its universality, is the communion of local or particular churches, end quote. Without any surrender of earlier statements, this makes an emphasis long familiar to those of Congregational and Baptist persuasions. Pope Leo XIII, 1878 to 1903, faced the Kulturkampf of Bismarck in Germany, its influence in Switzerland, and a dedicated statism in virtually every country. In Inscrutabile Dei Concilio, April 21, 1878, he spoke against the laws, quote, that shake the structure of the Catholic Church and the confiscation of property that was once the support of the Church's ministers and of the poor, end quote, as well as the removal of charitable institutions from the control of the Church. He reminded civil authorities, quote, that the teaching of Christ is, as Augustine used to say, a great blessing to the state if obeyed, end quote. The peace and safety of the state is bound up with the peace and safety of the Church. The Christian Constitution of States was the subject of Immortali Dei, November 1, 1885. He condemned the humanistic concepts of state authority. True authority is inseparable from the public profession of Christianity. All men must face God's judgment, and therefore every area of man's life must be governed by God. This means that true religion is necessary, and this, Leo said, Christ, quote, committed to his church to protect and to propagate, end quote. God has established two powers, the ecclesiastical and the civil. Each must have a regard for the nature and power of the other. Religion is a public concern and cannot be left to private judgment any more than civil government can. The attempt of the state to reduce the Church to the status of ordinary private association is an act of arrogance. Quote, to wish the Church to be subject to the civil power in the exercise of her duty is a great folly and a sheer injustice, end quote. The people are not the source of authority, quote, the origin of public power is to be sought for in God himself and not in the multitude, end quote. It is to be sought from God through the Catholic Church, Leo said in Officio Sanctissimo, December the 22nd, 1887, quote, "To her has he given in charge all he has revealed to men and established as sole interpreter, judge, and mistress, most wise and infallible of the truth, whose precepts states as well as individuals must hear and accept." End quote. Religious toleration was thus condemned, and Leo declared in Libertas, June the 20th, 1888, that it was an excuse by liberals for refusing to allow the Catholic Church to be free. Morality, said Leo in Au milieu des solitudes, February the 16th, 1892, enters into every human act, and morality signifies an order of dependence upon truth. Since truth is derived from God, a secular state forsakes truth in forsaking God. Hostility to Christianity by the state is thus a most dangerous course. On November the 1st, 1900, Leo in Tameste Futuro Prosapientibus attacked the faith which rejects Christ's kingship and, quote, places man at the summit of all things and declares that human nature must rule supreme, end quote. The supremacy of man is founded entirely on selfishness, not upon the love of God as manifested in Christ. Quote, man may indeed be king through Jesus Christ, but only on condition that he first of all obey God and diligently seek his rule of life in God's law. By the law of Christ, we mean not only the natural precepts of morality and the ancient law, all of which Jesus Christ has perfected and crowned by his declaration, explanation, and sanction, but also the rest of his doctrine and his own peculiar institutions. Of these, the chief is his church. Indeed, whatsoever things Christ has instituted are most fully contained in his church. End quote. Religion and politics cannot be separated. Leo held in Cum Multa, December the 8th, 1882, and those who would do so separate the political sphere from its health and prosperity. A sound relationship between the two powers, civil and ecclesiastical, is as much in the interest of the state as of the church. Nobilissima Gallorum Gens, February the 8th, 1884. Since the authority to rule comes from God, quote, whosoever rules, he is the minister of God, end quote, and must acknowledge the source of his authority. Humanum Genus, April the 20th, 1884. The source of all human power is in God. Quote, but in order that justice may be retained in governments, it is of the highest importance that those who rule states should understand that political power was not created for the advantage of any private individual, and that the administration of the state must be carried on to the profit of those who have been committed to their care, not to the profit of those to whom it has been committed. Diuturnum, June the 29th, 1881. In Leo XIII, the Catholic Church had a scholar pope who, after centuries of extensive retreat, advanced very clearly and firmly the claims of the Church against statism. Without the rancour or self-promotion of Pius IX, Leo developed a substantial foundation for resistance to the currents of humanistic statism. Resistance, however, requires more than leadership. The infiltration of the currents of liberalism into all churches would in time undermine the best forces of resistance. Certainly, Pius X, 1903 to 1914, in calling for the restoration of all things in Christ in E Supremae, October the 4th, 1903, struck the right note. His pontificate was marked, however, by a return to the intransigence of Pius IX. He saw the commission of Jeremiah 1:10 as also his own. Lo, I have set thee this day over the nations and over kingdoms to root up and to pull down, and to waste and to destroy, and to build and to plant. He declared that, quote, the way to reach Christ is not hard to find. It is the church, end quote. In Vehementer Nos, February 11th, 1906, Pius X attacked two current assumptions, among other things. First, that the state must be separated from the church, and second, that the state must not recognize any particular faith or church. The separation of church and state was the subject on January the 6th, 1907, of Une fois encore in Ascendi Domini Gregis, September the 8th, 1907. Pius dealt with modernistic doctrines, among them, quote, the principle that in temporal matters the state possesses absolute mastery, end quote. From this it followed, quote, that when the believer, not fully satisfied with his merely internal acts of religion, proceeds to external acts, such, for instance, as the administration or reception of the sacraments, these will fall under the control of the state. What will then become of ecclesiastical authority, which can only be exercised by external acts? Obviously, it will be completely under the dominion of the state, end quote. Unlike past challenges to the freedom of the Church, the modern tyranny denied the Christian doctrines of truth and justice, and so constituted a greater menace, according to Editai Saipai, May the 26th, 1910. At this point, Pius X came to the heart of the matter. Liberals, Protestant and Catholic, were blind to the fact that the basic faith of society had shifted to a non-Christian premise. The virtues they prized with their Christian upbringing had no roots in the new culture. All things now had new and alien meanings, so that truth and justice as men had known them in Christendom were being set aside. Pope Benedict XV, 1914 to 1922, in his appeal for peace, Ad Beatissimi Apostolorum, November 1st, 1914, declared the heart of the current evil to be in the hearts of human society, in the abandonment of the precepts of Christianity. Paganism had revived, he declared in Humani Generis Redemptionem on June 15th, 1917, and he blamed the failure of preaching for the revival of paganism. Quote, the causes of these evils are varied and manifold. No one, however, will gainsay the deplorable fact that the ministers of the word do not apply thereto an adequate remedy. Has the word of God then ceased to be what it was described by the apostle, living and effectual and more piercing than any two-edged sword? If that weapon does not everywhere produce its effect, the blame certainly must be laid on those ministers of the gospel who do not handle it as they should. For no one can maintain that the apostles were living in better times than ours, that they found minds more readily disposed towards the gospel, or that they met with less opposition to the law of God. End quote. It should be noted that Benedict XV applied the faith practically in a number of ways. During World War II, he established an international missing persons bureau in the Vatican. He was actively concerned with the relief of poor children in Central Europe. He manifested a love of the Bible, and he was strong in advocating biblical preaching. Pius XI, 1922 to 1939, in Iniquis Affectesque, November 18, 1926, spoke out against the persecution of the Catholic Church in Mexico. The Church was disestablished and separated from the state, and both priests and religious men were forbidden to open or conduct elementary schools. Foreign priests and religious men were expelled from Mexico. On December 31st, 1928, Pius XI, in Representante in Terra, spoke on Christian education as a prior right of the Church and family, and not an area of state control. He also opposed education of the sexes together. The education of the youth belongs to both Church and state, he held, which meant Church-controlled, state-supported schools. It is not enough for the school to give some religious instruction. Quote, it is necessary that all the teaching and the whole organization of the school and its teachers, syllabus and textbooks in every branch be regulated by the Christian spirit under the direction and material supervision of the Church. End quote. It was at this point that the weakness of the Vatican's approach became obvious. The modern state was increasingly a humanistic and anti-Christian power whose politics embodied a radically alien doctrine of salvation. The Vatican spoke and negotiated as though these were traditional constituent states within Christendom who were temporarily erring. The result was a policy of negotiation which only masked a steady retreat. At the same time, papal encyclicals gave much attention to ecclesiastical and pietistic concerns rather than the theology of humanistic statism and the Christian position. The desire to establish concordats with these powers meant a process of accommodation very much like the American policy of détente with the Soviet Union. Détente did not eliminate the conflict, it merely masked it, and so too did the Vatican's desire for concordats during the years up to 1939. Pius XI was keenly aware of the Church's sufferings in various countries, but he relied on diplomacy rather than confrontation. The statist powers kept the Church in their realm bound to their concordat without feeling bound themselves. In Mit brennender Sorge, March 14, 1937, Pius XI showed his awareness of what German National Socialism meant. He declared, quote, "The believer has an absolute right to profess his faith and live according to its dictates. Laws which impede this profession and practice of faith are against natural law." End quote. Benedict XV had placed the blame for the weakness of the Church on non-biblical preaching. Other popes were able analysts of the opposition, but failed to see, as Benedict did, the sources of the Church's power. Pius XI in Divinae Redemptoris, March 19, 1937, set forth the evil of atheistic communism. The Vatican had assumed the position of negation, which also marked the conservative politics of the Western democracies, able and telling critiques of the opposition, but little of the dynamics of a positive and active faith. Pius XI's last encyclical, In Gravescentibus Malis, September the 29th, 1937, was on the Rosary. Like others, he put great trust in pietistic hopes, declaring, quote, 22. The Holy Rosary, besides, not only serves admirably to overcome the enemies of God and religion, but is also a stimulus and spur to the practice of evangelic virtues which it injects and cultivates in our souls. Above all, it nourishes the Catholic faith, which flourishes again by due meditation on the sacred mysteries and raises minds to the truth revealed us by God. End quote. As the world moved into World War II, Catholics were offered the Rosary, and Protestants were looking for the rapture and deeply committed to the efficacy of pious gush. It must be added that Pius XI in Quas Primas, December the 11th, 1925, spoke on the kingship of Christ, and very plainly declaring, quote, 13. The foundation of this power and dignity of our Lord is rightly indicated by Cyril of Alexandria. Christ, he says, quote, has dominion over all creatures, a dominion not seized by violence nor usurped, but his by essence and by nature. End quote. His kingdom is founded upon the ineffable hypostatic union. From this it follows not only that Christ is to be adored by angels and by men, but that to him, as man, angels and men are subject, and must recognize his empire by reason of the hypostatic union, Christ his power over all creatures. But a thought that must give us even greater joy and consolation is this, that Christ is our King by acquired as well as by natural right, for he is our Redeemer. Would that they who forget what they have cost their Saviour might recall the words, quote, You were not redeemed with corruptible things, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb unspotted and undefiled. End quote. We are no longer our own property, for Christ has purchased us, quote, with a great price, end quote. Our very bodies are the, quote, members of Christ, end quote, end quote. In Quadragesimo Anno, May the 15th, 1931, Pius XI spoke on the reconstruction of the social order. This important encyclical manifested clearly a problem of considerable dimensions. The rise of capitalism had introduced a new factor into the Western world. This rise had coincided with the rise of liberalism. It had some roots in liberalism and many more in medieval and Reformation culture. The Vatican viewed the rise of the free market with elements of distrust as well as a grudging tribute. There was a lack of appreciation for the role of society in a culture. The traditional pattern of church, state, and workers' associations seemed safer. Thus, while struggling against the corporate state, the papacy was unable to set forth the free market as a tenable alternative to state regulation. As a result, in facing the economic crisis of the Depression, Pius XI in Nova Impendet, October 2nd, 1931, had no real answer, only a summons to a, quote, crusade of piety and of love, end quote. Charitable institutions did become active, but neither Catholic nor Protestant thinkers analysed at all well the statist interventionism into the economy and its monetary systems which had led to the Great Depression. The stress of Pius XII was on the internal reform of the Catholic Church and on the development of Catholic piety. His pontificate from 1939 to 1958 covered some of the most eventful years in the world's history. While diplomatically active with respect to National Socialism and Communism, his intellectual and dogmatic contributions to the church and state issue were limited. After Pius XII, the papacy entered a new phase, with bishops exerting more freedom. It would be very wrong to infer that Pius XII was not aware of the theological issues between church and state. His forte had been diplomacy, and it was through diplomacy that he sought to solve the problems of the day. His successors, while not undiplomatic by any means, have explored other channels. How keenly aware Pius XII was of the basic issue, as well as of the importance of freedom, was made clear on October 20th, 1939, in his first encyclical, Summae Pontificatus, on the unity of human society. Quote, 60. To consider the state as something ultimate to which everything else should be subordinated and directed cannot fail to harm the true and lasting prosperity of nations. This can happen either when unrestricted dominion comes to be conferred on the state as having a mandate from the nation, people, or even a social order, or when the state arrogates such dominion to itself as absolute master, despotically, without any mandate whatsoever. If, in fact, the state lays claim to and directs private enterprises, these, ruled as they are by delicate and complicated internal principles which guarantee and assure the realization of their special aims, may be damaged to the detriment of the public good by being wrenched from their natural surroundings, that is, from responsible private action. End quote. Pius XII was more aware of the basic issues than most of his contemporaries. In dealing with the oppression of the Church by Chinese communism, Pius XII, in his last encyclical, Ad Apostolorum Principis, July 29th, 1958, said that, quote, Christianity never opposes nor obstructs what is truly useful or advantageous to a country. It renders to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but not what belongs to God. Quote, 23. However, if Christians are bound in conscience to render to Caesar, that is, to human authority, what belongs to Caesar, then Caesar likewise, or those who control the state, cannot exact obedience when they would be usurping God's rights or forcing Christians either to act at variance with their religious duties or to sever themselves from the unity of the Church and its lawful hierarchy. End quote. Pius XII's pontificate was marked by the strongly personal rule of a seasoned diplomat. He was an unceasing foe of atheism and socialism in all its forms, but he fought as a diplomat. Given the heightened world crisis since 1958, one would expect an even greater confrontation and challenge by the popes to the atheistic and anti-Christian statism of the nations. The encyclicals of John XXIII, 1958 to 1963, of Paul VI, 1963 to 1978, and of John Paul II, since 1978, none were issued by John Paul I, are surprisingly weak in this regard. The issue of church and state is bypassed, as is communism, except for Paul VI in Ecclesiam Suam, August 6, 1964, sections 101 to 103. Paul VI in the same encyclical spoke of atheism, section 104, and in Populorum Progressio, March 26, 1967, section 39, he spoke briefly of atheism. Little else has been said since 1958. In Ecclesiam Suam, Paul VI raised the question, quote, how is the Church to adapt its mission to the particular age, environment, educational and social conditions of men's lives? End quote. This was the key adaptation. It ran from strategic considerations to liberation theology, a form of theological Marxism. The supposedly revolutionary changes in the Church often resembled surrender and retreat more than change. John Paul II in Redemptor Hominis, March 4, 1979, showed evidences of his earlier existentialism in declaring that, for the Church, all ways lead to man. The Church, he said, must endeavour, quote, to make human life more human, end quote, a statement which is a far cry from the older standard that human life must be made godly. Man's life and soul, said John Paul II, are his own. Again, a departure from the doctrine that man is God's creation and property. John Paul II introduced into the dogmatic life of the Church radically existentialist premises, declaring in the same encyclical, quote, man, in the full truth of his existence, of his personal being, in the sphere of his own family, in the sphere of society in very diverse contexts, in the sphere of his own nation or people, perhaps still only that of his clan or tribe, and in the sphere of the whole of mankind, this man is the primary route that the Church must travel in fulfilling her mission. He is the primary and fundamental way for the Church, the way traced out by Christ himself, the way that leads invariably through the mystery of the Incarnation and the redemption, end quote. He said further, quote, because man, every man without any exception whatever, has been redeemed by Christ, and because with each man without any exception whatever, Christ is in a way united, even when man is unaware of it, end quote. It follows that, quote, this man is the way for the Church, end quote, and is, quote, the basis of all other ways that the Church must walk, end quote. Man had replaced Christ as the way, and Christ was now the existentialist principle, not the Lord of old. These three popes also showed confusion in their grasp of economic matters. John Paul II in Laborum Exercens, September 14, 1981, held that there could be no, quote, legitimate title, end quote, to property unless it served labour. Earlier in Pacem in Terris, April 11, 1963, John XXIII called for a world community without Christian faith as its premise. Pacem in Terris stressed the rights of man, and it saw more hope apparently in a world community than in Jesus Christ. The Catholic Church was shifting its foundations, a recipe for disaster. Earlier, chapter 35, we saw that, in the 13th century, according to Strayer, men's loyalty and trust shifted from family, community and church to the state. In France, this was clear in the late 13th century in the reign of Philip the Fair, quote, the high priest of the religion of monarchy, end quote. Philip saw himself as a good Catholic, but he saw the state as central, the king as a vicar of God whom to oppose was sacrilege. He believed that, as such, he had healing power. In his conflict with the papacy, he had a great advantage. Many bishops as well as commoners agreed with him. The king, moreover, could reward a man better and more quickly than the pope, and also hurt him more quickly. Philip claimed the right to control everything within his realm, including the church. Philip was able to replace the intransigent Pope Boniface VIII with the radically subservient Clement V. Boniface VIII is remembered for the claims set forth in the bull Unam Sanctum. November the 18th, 1302, with its high claims for the papacy. Humanistic as well as Protestant historians do not seem to be aware that popes like Boniface VIII often made up for their impotence or weakness with extravagant claims. Boniface, no model pope, was condemned by a council called by Philip, seized by a military force, the papal palace sacked, and left a broken man who died a month after his return to Rome. Benedict XI, his successor, lived only 11 months, with rumours that he was poisoned circulating. After a year's battle, the cardinals gave in to Philip's choice, Clement V, who later settled at Avignon, beginning the long, quote, Babylonian captivity, end quote, of the popes. Actually, whether in Avignon or Rome, they were controlled whenever possible, sometimes brutally. The puppet popes like Clement V promoted themselves, became patrons of the arts, and were commonly subservient to some monarch. Man's new religion was statism, and it controlled the church whenever possible. For centuries, the monarchs and princes were favourable to Christianity, but as a servant of the state. After the French Revolution, Christianity was steadily separated from the state and persecuted. The result has been conflict. The tragedy is when churchmen adopt the faith of the enemy and call it liberation.